The blizzard had come down from the mountains without warning, transforming the Arizona high country into a death trap of white that would have killed her within the hour if Xavier Holbrook had not been riding that particular stretch of trail on that particular December afternoon in 1881. He saw the dark shape against the snow first, a huddled form beside an overturned wagon that had clearly lost its battle with the storm. Xavier urged his horse forward through the driving wind, his face stinging from the ice crystals that felt like needles against his skin. When he got close enough to see properly, his heart lurched in his chest. It was a woman, curled into herself, her lips already taking on that blue tinge that meant death was knocking at her door. "Miss," he called out, dismounting quickly and kneeling beside her. "Miss, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, brown eyes that looked up at him with a confusion that came from being too cold for too long. She tried to speak, but her teeth were chattering so violently that no words could form. Xavier did not waste time with more questions. He stripped off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her, then lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and he could feel how her whole body was shaking. "I will keep you close forever," he whispered against her hair, not even knowing why he said such words, only knowing that something about finding her like this, helpless and nearly frozen, had awakened something fierce and protective in his chest. "You are going to be all right. I promise you that." His horse, a reliable bay gelding named Copper, stood steady as Xavier managed to get himself and the woman into the saddle. He held her against his chest, sharing what warmth he had left, and turned Copper's head toward the line shack he knew was less than 2 miles from the spot. The storm was getting worse by the minute, and if they did not find shelter soon, they would both be adding their bones to the high country. The ride felt like it took hours, though it could not have been more than 20 minutes. Xavier kept talking to the woman, even though she seemed barely conscious, because he had heard once that the sound of a human voice could help keep someone from slipping away. He told her about the line shack, about how it would have a stove and firewood, about how he was going to get her warm. He told her his name and asked for hers, but she only made small sounds against his chest, when the rough wooden structure finally appeared through the curtain of snow. Xavier felt relief flood through him so strongly that his hands shook as he dismounted. He kicked the door open and carried the woman inside, laying her down on the narrow cot in the corner. The shack was small, just one room with a potbelly stove, a cot, a table, and a few shelves stocked with supplies for cowboys riding the winter range. It was meant as an emergency shelter, and right now it felt like salvation. Xavier got the stove going with practiced efficiency, feeding it kindling and then larger pieces of wood until flames were crackling inside. Then he turned his attention back to the woman. Her clothes were soaked through, and he knew he needed to get her out of them if she had any chance of surviving. He hesitated, propriety warring with practicality, but practicality won. He had seen men die of cold before, and he would not let that happen to her. "I am sorry," he said, even though she seemed unconscious now. "But these wet things will kill you." He worked as quickly and respectfully as he could, removing her wet dress and layers of underclothings, averting his eyes as much as possible. He wrapped her in every blanket he could find in the shack, then pulled the cot closer to the stove. Her skin was still too pale, her breathing too shallow, and fear clutched at Xavier's heart. He had never felt anything quite like this before, this desperate need to keep someone alive. He hung her wet clothes near the stove to dry and then shrugged out of his own wet outer layers, hanging them up as well. The shack was starting to warm up, the storm howling outside but unable to reach them here. Xavier pulled the single chair over beside the cot and sat down, watching the woman's face. She was beautiful, He realized now that he could actually see her properly. Her hair was a rich brown, spread out across the pillow in waves. Her face was delicate, but with a strength in the set of her jaw that spoke of character. He must have dozed off at some point because he startled awake to find her eyes open and looking at him. They were clearer now, more focused, though confusion still clouded them. "Where?" she started, then stopped, her hand moving to pull the blankets higher as she realized her state of undress. "You are safe," Xavier said quickly, holding up his hands. "I found you in the storm. Your wagon was overturned. You were nearly frozen. I brought you here to a lined shack, got you warm. I had to remove your wet clothes. They were going to kill you. I did not look more than necessary, I give you my word on that." She stared at him for a long moment, and he could see her processing this information. "How long?" "Few hours now. It is still storming outside. We are stuck here until it passes." "My name," she said softly, "is Sarah Jane Johnson. I was traveling to Wilcox to meet my aunt. She runs a boarding house there. I have never been to Arizona before. I came from Missouri." "Xavier Holbrook," he replied. "I ride for the latter ranch, checking on cattle in the high country. This is one of our lined shacks. You are lucky I was out here. Not many people ride this area in winter." "Lucky," Sarah repeated, and something that might have been a laugh or a sob escaped her. "I thought I was going to die. The storm came so fast. My driver, he panicked when the horses bolted. The wagon went over and she stopped, her eyes filling with tears. "He hit his head on a rock. He was dead before I could even try to help him." Xavier felt his chest tighten. "I am sorry. That is a hard thing to see. I tried to stay with the wagon, but I was so cold. I must have wandered away from it. Everything became confused. Then you were there." She looked at him with those brown eyes, and Xavier felt something shift in the region of his heart. "You said something when you found me. What was it?" He felt heat rise in his face that had nothing to do with the stove. "I do not rightly remember. I was focused on getting you to safety." Sarah's eyes said she knew he was not being entirely truthful, but she let it pass. "Thank you for saving my life, for being decent about everything. Any man would have done the same. I am not so sure about that, but I am grateful it was you who found me." The storm raged for another day and night. Xavier kept the fire going and heated up some of the beans and salt pork that were stored in the shack. Sarah's clothes dried, and he turned his back while she dressed herself, though the memory of her skin, pale and cold under his hands, seemed burned into his mind. They talked to pass the time, sharing stories of their lives. Sarah told him about growing up in Missouri, about her parents dying of fever the previous summer, about having no one left except this aunt in Wilcox, whom she had never met but who had written and offered her a home. Xavier told her about growing up on a small ranch in Texas, about learning to rope and ride almost before he could walk, about drifting west after his own family had been killed in a Comanche raid when he was 17. That had been 6 years ago, and he had been wandering ever since, working ranches from Texas to Arizona. "You ever think about settling down?" Sarah asked on the second afternoon as they sat near the stove, the storm finally showing signs of easing outside. "Sometimes," Xavier admitted. "But I never seemed to find a reason to stop moving, never found a place that felt like home, I guess." "I used to think Missouri was home," Sarah said softly. "But now that my parents are gone, it just feels like a place full of ghosts. I am hoping Wilcox might become something new for me. A fresh start. Wilcox is a decent town, little rough around the edges like most of Arizona, but there are good people there. Your aunt, she has a boarding house, you said." "Yes, Margaret Johnson. She is my father's sister." They had not spoken in years, some old family argument, but when she heard about my parents, she wrote to me. Said I should come west, that there were opportunities here for someone willing to work hard. That is true enough. Arizona is still young, still being built. A person can make something of themselves here. The way Sarah looked at him then made Xavier's pulse quicken. There was something in her eyes, a warmth and interest that he felt echoed in his own chest. He had known her for less than 2 full days, but it felt like longer. There was something about sharing survival, about being trapped together in the storm, that had created an intimacy between them that might have taken weeks or months under normal circumstances. "Will you take me to Wilcox when the storm clears?" Sarah asked. "I will pay you, of course." "Whatever is fair." "I will take you," Xavier said, "but I will not take your money. It is on my way, and it would be my honor to see you safely to your aunt's door." The storm broke that evening, the clouds parting to reveal a sky full of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. In the morning they set out, Sarah riding behind Xavier on Copper, her arms wrapped around his waist. They found her overturned wagon, and Xavier helped her salvage what could be saved of her belongings, strapping a trunk and a few bags to his saddle. The driver's body was frozen solid, and Xavier promised Sarah he would send someone back to retrieve it for proper burial. The ride to Wilcox took most of the day. The snow lay thick on the ground, but Copper was sure-footed and the sky remained clear. Sarah kept her arms around Xavier's waist, and he found himself hyper-aware of every place her body touched his. They talked as they rode, conversation coming easily, and Xavier realized he was dreading the moment when they would reach Wilcox, and he would have to say goodbye to her. The town appeared in the late afternoon, a collection of wooden buildings along a single main street with smaller roads branching off. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sound of a piano drifted from one of the saloons. Xavier guided Copper down the main street, asking directions from a man outside the general store. Margaret Johnson's boarding house turned out to be a large 2-story structure on the edge of town, painted white with green shutters and a sign hanging from the porch that read, "Johnson House Clean Rooms Good Meals." Xavier helped Sarah down from the horse and carried her trunk up to the porch. Before he could knock, the door opened and a woman in her 40s appeared, her face lighting up as she saw Sarah. "You must be Sarah," she said, pulling the younger woman into an embrace. "I have been so worried. The stage line sent word that you never arrived, and then we heard about the storm. I feared the worst." "This is Xavier Holbrook," Sarah said, pulling back and gesturing to him. "He saved my life, found me in the storm, and kept me safe until it passed." Margaret Johnson turned to Xavier with tears in her eyes and seized his hand. "I cannot thank you enough. She is all the family I have left, if you had not been there." "I am just glad I was riding that trail," Xavier said, feeling awkward under her gratitude. "Sarah is a strong woman. She held on until help came." "You must let me pay you," Margaret insisted. "No payment needed, madam." "I am just glad I could help." "Then at least stay for supper. It is the least I can do, I insist." Xavier found himself agreeing, though he told himself it was only because Margaret Johnson seemed like the type of woman who would not take no for an answer, not because he was desperate for any excuse to spend more time with Sarah. Margaret ushered them both inside, showing Sarah to a room upstairs where she could rest and change, while Xavier waited in the parlor. The boarding house was warm and comfortable, with good solid furniture and lace curtains at the windows. Xavier could hear voices from somewhere deeper in the house, other boarders going about their business. When Sarah came back down, she had changed into a fresh dress of deep blue that brought out the color in her eyes. Her hair was brushed and pinned up, and Xavier felt his breath catch at the sight of her. Supper was a lively affair, with Margaret and 3 of her boarders joining Xavier and Sarah at the large dining table. There was a widowed schoolteacher named Mrs. Patterson, a young surveyor named James who was mapping the area for the railroad, and an older man named Mr. Clemens who worked as a clerk at the bank. The food was excellent, roasted chicken and potatoes and fresh bread, and the conversation flowed easily. Xavier found himself telling the story of finding Sarah in the storm, and everyone listened with rapt attention. Sarah added her own perspective, and when she got to the part about waking up in the lined shack, safe and warm, her eyes met Xavier's across the table with such warmth that he felt it down to his toes. After supper, Margaret insisted that Xavier must stay the night rather than ride back to the ranch in the dark. He accepted, though he knew he would pay for the room despite her protests. When the others had retired for the evening, Xavier found himself alone with Sarah in the parlor, the two of them sitting near the fire that crackled in the hearth. "I do not want you to go," Sarah said softly, not looking at him. "Is that foolish? I have only known you 2 days." "If it is foolish, then I am foolish too," Xavier replied, "because I have been trying to think of reasons to stay in Wilcox instead of riding back to the ranch." "Then stay," Sarah said, finally turning to look at him. "Not here at the boarding house, that would not be proper, but stay in town. There must be work here for a man with your skills. I have a job at the latter ranch. I have been there almost a year now. I cannot just walk away from it." "Then let me be selfish for a moment," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. "What you said when you found me, in the snow." "Do you remember?" Xavier swallowed hard. "I remember. You said you would keep me close forever. Did you mean that, or was it just something said in the moment?" "I meant it," Xavier admitted, the words coming easier than he expected. "I do not understand it myself. I saw you there, so close to death, and something in me just knew that you were important, that I could not let you slip away. It does not make sense, I know that, but it is the truth." Sarah reached across the space between them and took his hand. Her fingers were warm now, so different from the frozen touch of 2 days ago. "It makes perfect sense to me, because I felt it too. Even through the cold and confusion, I felt it, this connection between us, like I had been waiting my whole life to be found by you." Xavier raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "Then I will find a way to stay. I will ride out to the ranch tomorrow, collect my pay and my things, and tell the foreman I am not coming back. Wilcox must have need of a man who can handle horses and cattle and a gun if necessary." "The sheriff was here for dinner last week," Sarah said, excitement brightening her face. "Aunt Margaret mentioned he was looking for a deputy, someone steady and reliable. I have never been a lawman before. But you have been in this country for years. You know how to handle yourself. And you are good and decent. Those seem like fine qualities for a deputy." Xavier felt hope kindle in his chest. A deputy's job would pay enough to live on, maybe even save a little, and it would keep him in Wilcox, close to Sarah. "I will speak with the sheriff then. See if he thinks I might be suited for the work." "You will be perfect," Sarah said with such conviction that Xavier could not help but believe her. They sat up late into the night, talking in low voices so as not to disturb the other boarders. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing dreams and fears and memories. Xavier learned that Sarah loved to read, that she had a talent for painting, that she made the best apple pie in 3 counties according to her late mother. Sarah learned that Xavier had a way with horses that bordered on magical, that he had once wanted to be a rancher with his own land, that he carried a small wooden horse in his pocket that his father had carved for him when he was 5 years old. When Xavier finally went up to his room, his head was full of Sarah's laugh, and the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she was amused. He lay in the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, knowing that his life had just changed in ways he could not fully comprehend yet. 2 days ago, he had been a drifting cowboy with no ties and no particular future. Now he had something to stay for, someone who made the idea of putting down roots seem not just possible but necessary. He rode out to the latter ranch the next morning, making the trip in good time now that the storm had passed. The foreman, a gruff man named Donovan, accepted Xavier's resignation with a shrug and paid him his wages. Xavier collected his few belongings, which fit easily into his saddlebags, and headed back to Wilcox, feeling lighter than he had in years. Sheriff Tom Miller was a weathered man in his 50s with intelligent gray eyes and a no-nonsense manner. He listened as Xavier explained his situation and his interest in the deputy position. Then he asked Xavier about his experience, his gun skills, and his reasons for wanting the job. Xavier was honest, including the part about meeting Sarah and wanting to stay in Wilcox to see where that might lead. "At least you are being straight with me," Sheriff Miller said. "I appreciate that. Truth is, I could use a deputy who knows this territory and can handle himself. We get trouble now and then, cattle thieves mostly, sometimes a drunk cowboy who needs cooling off. Nothing too exciting most days, but you need to be ready for when it gets interesting." "I can handle interesting," Xavier said. "The pay is $40 a month plus a room above the jail. Not much, but it is steady work. You would start by learning the town, meeting people, making yourself known as someone they can trust. Think you can do that?" "Yes, sir." "Then the job is yours. Welcome to law enforcement, Deputy Holbrook." Xavier moved into the small room above the jail that afternoon. It was sparse but clean, with a bed, a chair, a small table, and a window that looked out over the main street. Sheriff Miller gave him a badge and showed him around the office, explaining the routines and expectations. Xavier pinned the badge to his vest and felt the weight of it, both literal and figurative. He was a lawman now, responsible for protecting this town and its people. It felt right in a way that surprised him. He went to the boarding house for supper that evening, and Sarah's face when she saw his badge made every decision worth it. Her smile could have lit up the whole territory, Xavier thought. After the meal, they walked together through the town, Xavier pointing out various buildings and businesses, Sarah asking questions and laughing at his stories. It was cold, their breath making clouds in the evening air, but Xavier barely noticed. He was too aware of Sarah walking beside him, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. "You look good with that badge," Sarah said as they paused outside the general store to look at the display in the window. "I am still getting used to the idea of wearing it," Xavier admitted. "Never thought I would be on this side of the law. You were never on the other side, were you?" "No, but I have always been just a drifter. Now I am supposed to be someone people look up to, someone responsible. It is a strange feeling." "You will be wonderful at it, I know you will." Xavier turned to face her fully. They were standing under the overhang of the store, somewhat sheltered from the view of passers-by. "Sarah, I know this is all moving fast, too fast probably, but I need you to know that I am serious about this, about you. About staying in Wilcox and building something real here." "I am serious too," Sarah said softly. "I came to Wilcox because I had nowhere else to go, but now I am glad I came, because if I had not, I would never have met you. I would never have known what this feels like." "What does it feel like?" Xavier asked, though he thought he knew. He wanted to hear her say it anyway. "Like coming home," Sarah whispered. "Like being found." Xavier kissed her then, gently, his hands cradling her face. Her lips were soft and warm, and she made a small sound of pleasure that went straight to his heart. When they pulled apart, both of them were breathing harder, and Xavier had to resist the urge to kiss her again immediately. "We should be courting properly," he said, his voice rough. "I should be calling on you with your aunt as chaperone, bringing you flowers, all of that." "Then let us do that," Sarah agreed. even though we both know we are already far past that in our hearts. Xavier did court her properly over the weeks that followed. He called at the boarding house 3 evenings a week, sitting with Sarah in the parlor while Margaret or one of the other boarders served as chaperone. He brought her flowers when he could find them in winter, and books from the general store because he knew she loved to read. They went on walks through town, attended church together on Sundays, and went to a dance at the community hall where Xavier discovered that Sarah was graceful on her feet, and he was decidedly less so, though she laughed and said he was improving. Xavier settled into his role as deputy, learning the rhythms of the town and earning the respect of its citizens. He broke up fights at the saloons, retrieved a stolen horse, and helped calm a situation when a dispute between neighbors over property lines threatened to turn violent. Sheriff Miller said he had made a good choice in hiring Xavier, that he had good instincts for the work. Christmas came, and Xavier spent it at the boarding house with Sarah, Margaret, and the other boarders. Sarah gave him a scarf she had knitted herself in shades of brown and blue, and Xavier gave her a locket he had found at the jeweler's shop, a delicate silver oval that opened to hold 2 small photographs. Sarah put it on immediately, and Xavier knew she would wear it always. Winter gave way to early spring, and Xavier knew he could not wait any longer. He had been certain after the first week that Sarah was the woman he wanted to spend his life with. Now, after 3 months of courting, he was more certain than ever. He asked Margaret for permission first, a conversation that left the older woman in tears as she gave her blessing. Then he asked Sheriff Miller for an advance on his pay so he could buy a proper ring from the jeweler. He proposed to Sarah on an evening in March, taking her for a walk to a spot just outside of town, where a large cottonwood tree stood beside a stream that was running high with snowmelt from the mountains. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and Sarah looked so beautiful in the light that Xavier almost forgot his carefully prepared words. "Sarah," he began, taking both of her hands in his. "3 months ago I found you in a snowstorm and you changed my entire life. Before you I was just drifting. I had no home, no future, nothing to hold on to. But you gave me a reason to stay in one place. You gave me a reason to become more than I was. You gave me hope and happiness and a future I want to build. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. Will you marry me?" He pulled out the ring, a simple gold band with a small diamond, and held it out to her. Sarah's eyes were shining with tears, but she was smiling. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, Xavier, I will marry you. I love you so much. From the moment you found me, from the moment you said you would keep me close forever, I have been yours." Xavier slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her, and it felt like a promise and a beginning all at once. They stood under the cottonwood tree as the sun set completely and the stars began to appear, holding each other and talking about the future they would build together. They were married 6 weeks later in the small church in Wilcox. Margaret cried through the entire ceremony, and Sheriff Miller stood as Xavier's best man. Sarah wore a dress of cream-colored silk that Margaret helped her make, and she carried a bouquet of spring wildflowers that Xavier had ridden into the hills to gather that morning. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier kissed Sarah and felt a completeness he had never known before. They moved into a small house on the edge of town that Xavier had been renting from a widow named Mrs. Fletcher. It was not much, just 3 rooms and a porch, but it was theirs. Sarah filled it with curtains she sewed and paintings she made and the smell of her cooking. Xavier would come home after his shifts at the jail to find her working in the small garden she had planted or sitting on the porch with a book. Every time he saw her, his heart swelled with gratitude and love. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. Xavier had to deal with a gang of cattle rustlers that Sheriff Miller, and he eventually tracked down and arrested after a tense confrontation that left Xavier with a bullet graze on his arm. Sarah nursed him back to health, scolding him for taking risks even as she carefully cleaned and bandaged his wound. Then Sarah herself fell ill with a fever that summer, and Xavier sat by her bedside for 3 days straight, terrified that he might lose her. When the fever finally broke, he held her and wept with relief, but the challenges only made their bond stronger. They learned how to navigate arguments and misunderstandings, how to support each other through difficult times, how to celebrate the good moments that made everything worthwhile. Xavier taught Sarah to ride, and she proved to be a natural horsewoman. Sarah taught Xavier to appreciate books and art, expanding his world in ways he had never imagined. They grew together, becoming not just husband and wife but true partners in every sense of the word. In their second year of marriage, Sarah told Xavier she was expecting a baby. Xavier felt joy and terror in equal measure, overwhelmed by the thought of being a father. Sarah seemed to glow with happiness, and Xavier found himself constantly amazed by the changes in her body, by the knowledge that they had created a new life together. Their son was born on a cold January night in 1883, almost exactly 2 years after Xavier had found Sarah in the snow. The labor was long and difficult, and Xavier spent hours pacing outside the bedroom while Margaret and the midwife attended to Sarah. When he finally heard the baby's cry, he burst into the room to find Sarah exhausted but smiling, holding a small bundle wrapped in blankets. "Meet your son," she said softly. Xavier took the baby carefully, afraid he might break something, and looked down at the tiny face. The baby had a shock of dark hair and Sarah's brown eyes, and Xavier felt his heart expand to accommodate this new overwhelming love. "We should name him Samuel," Sarah said, "after your father." "Samuel Holbrook," Xavier said, testing the name. "It sounds right." Samuel was a healthy, loud baby who demanded attention at all hours. Xavier and Sarah stumbled through those first months of parenthood in a haze of exhaustion and wonder. Xavier would take Samuel for walks around town while Sarah slept, the baby strapped to his chest in a sling Sarah had made. People in Wilcox stopped him constantly to admire the baby and congratulate him, and Xavier felt a pride and contentment he had never experienced before. Sheriff Miller retired when Samuel was 6 months old, and the town council asked Xavier to take over as sheriff. It was a promotion that came with more pay and more responsibility, and Xavier accepted, knowing that he wanted to provide the best life possible for his family. He hired a young man named Daniel as his deputy, someone he could trust to help keep Wilcox safe. Sarah started giving painting lessons to some of the women in town, bringing in a little extra money and finding fulfillment in teaching others. She would set up her easel in their small parlor, and students would come to learn about color and composition and technique. Xavier loved coming home to find the house full of women and conversation, loved seeing Sarah in her element, sharing something she was passionate about. When Samuel was 2 years old, Sarah told Xavier she was expecting again. Their daughter was born in the summer of 1885, an easier birth than Samuel's had been. They named her Emma, and she had Xavier's blonde hair and a temperament that was much calmer than her brother's had been. Samuel was fascinated by his little sister, constantly wanting to help take care of her, and Xavier and Sarah watched their family grow with grateful hearts. Life in Wilcox continued to evolve. The railroad came through in 1886, bringing more people and more commerce to the town. New businesses opened, and the population grew. Xavier found himself busier as sheriff, dealing with the various problems that came with a growing town. but he made sure to always put his family first, coming home for supper every night no matter what, taking Sundays off to spend with Sarah and the children. On Samuel's 5th birthday, Xavier took his family on a trip back to the high country where he had found Sarah all those years ago. They packed a wagon with supplies and camping gear and spent 3 days in the mountains, showing the children where their parents' story had begun. Samuel was fascinated by the story of how his father had rescued his mother from the snow, and little Emma listened with wide eyes, even though Xavier was not sure how much she understood. They visited the line shack, which was still standing and still used by cowboys from the latter ranch. Xavier told the children about carrying their mother through the storm, about keeping the fire going, about knowing even then that Sarah was special. Sarah added her own memories, about waking up to find Xavier watching over her, about feeling safe despite being in a strange place with a man she did not know. "You were meant to find each other," Samuel declared with the certainty of a child. "Yes, we were," Xavier agreed, pulling Sarah close and kissing the top of her head. "I was meant to find her and keep her close forever, just like I promised." They stood outside the line shack, the mountains rising around them, and Xavier felt the circle complete. This place where his life had changed, where he had found not just a woman to save but a future to build. He looked at Sarah, at their children, at the life they had created together, and he felt blessed beyond measure. That night, they camped under the stars, and Xavier lay with Sarah in his arms while the children slept nearby. The air was cool but not cold, and the sky was clear enough to see the Milky Way stretching overhead. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had not been riding that trail that day?" Sarah asked softly. "Sometimes," Xavier admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it. The important thing is that I was there, that I found you." "You saved me in more ways than one," Sarah said. "Not just from the storm, but from a life of loneliness. You gave me love and family and a home. You gave me everything." "You gave me the same," Xavier replied. "Before you, I was lost. I just did not know it. You gave me a purpose, a reason to build something that lasts." They lay in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the mountains. Then Sarah spoke again. "You remember what you said to me that first day? After you found me and you were carrying me to Copper, I said I would keep you close forever. You have kept that promise every single day since then. Even when we argue, even when things are hard, I always feel close to you, safe with you." Xavier tightened his arms around her. "I will keep that promise for the rest of my life. You and the children, you are my whole world now." "Everything I do is for you. I know," Sarah whispered. "I love you, Xavier Holbrook. I love you, Sarah Holbrook." They returned to Wilcox renewed and happy, falling back into the rhythms of their life. Xavier continued to serve as sheriff, earning the respect and gratitude of the town. Sarah's painting classes grew more popular, and she started selling some of her work as well. Beautiful landscapes of the Arizona territory that people wanted to hang in their homes. Samuel started school, proving to be bright and curious, while Emma was content to tag along with her mother, learning to paint and garden and cook. The years passed in a blur of seasons and celebrations. Samuel grew tall and strong, helping Xavier around the house and expressing interest in following in his father's footsteps as a lawman. Emma developed a talent for music, learning to play the piano that Xavier and Sarah saved up to buy for her. They had one more child, another daughter they named Grace, born when Samuel was 8 and Emma was 6. Grace was a happy, adventurous child who kept them all on their toes. Xavier watched his children grow with a mixture of pride and bittersweet awareness of time passing. He saw himself in Samuel's sense of justice and duty, saw Sarah in Emma's artistic temperament and Grace's warm heart. He and Sarah had created not just a family, but a legacy, people who would carry their love forward into the future. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier took Sarah back to the cottonwood tree by the stream where he had proposed. The tree had grown larger, its branches reaching wider, and the stream still ran clear and cold with mountain water. They stood in the same spot where Xavier had asked Sarah to marry him, and they renewed the vows they had made a decade earlier. 10 years, Sarah said, shaking her head in wonder. It feels like both forever and no time at all. The best 10 years of my life, Xavier replied. And I am looking forward to 50 more just like them. Only 50, Sarah teased. All right, 100 then. However long we get, it will not be enough. They kissed under the cottonwood tree, and Xavier felt the same rush of emotion he had felt the first time he kissed her. Time had not diminished his love for Sarah. If anything, it had deepened it, adding layers of shared experience and mutual respect to the initial passion and attraction. The town of Wilcox continued to grow and prosper. Electric lights came to the main street in the early 1890s, a wonder that the children could barely comprehend. The population swelled past 1,000, and there was talk of building a bigger school and a proper hospital. Xavier saw his role as sheriff evolve with the town, dealing with more complex issues, but still maintaining the personal connections that made Wilcox feel like a community, rather than just a place. Samuel turned 18 in 1901, and he asked Xavier if he could serve as a deputy. Xavier was torn between pride and fear, knowing the dangers that came with the job, but also recognizing that his son was grown and capable of making his own choices. He swore Samuel in as a deputy, and they worked side by side, father and son protecting the town together. Emma had become an accomplished pianist and was giving lessons to children in town, following in her mother's footsteps as a teacher. She had also caught the eye of a young man named Thomas who worked at the bank, and Xavier found himself in the strange position of evaluating his daughter's suitor. Thomas proved to be decent and hardworking, and when he asked Xavier for permission to court Emma, Xavier gave his blessing, even as his heart ached at the thought of his daughter growing up and eventually leaving home. Grace was 14 and still convinced she would never get married, declaring she would rather travel the world and paint exotic locations. Sarah just smiled and said Grace might change her mind someday, or she might not, and either way would be fine as long as she was happy. Xavier and Sarah settled into their 50s with Grace, their hair graying but their love as strong as ever. They had built something remarkable together, a family and a life that had started with a chance encounter in a snowstorm. Xavier still served as sheriff, though he let Samuel handle more of the day-to-day work now. Sarah still painted and taught, her work becoming more refined and sought after with each passing year. On a cold December evening in 1901, exactly 20 years after Xavier had found Sarah in the snow, they sat together on their porch wrapped in blankets, watching the sun set over the mountains. The children were all inside, the house warm and full of life behind them. 20 years, Xavier said, echoing Sarah's words from their anniversary years ago. Hard to believe. Do you ever regret it? Sarah asked. Giving up the drifting life to settle down with me. Xavier turned to look at her, this woman who had been his partner and love for 2 decades. Her hair was streaked with silver now, and there were lines at the corners of her eyes, but she was still the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Not for a single second, he said firmly. You gave me everything I did not know I was missing. Before you, I was just existing. With you, I have been truly living. Every day with you has been a gift. Even the hard days, Sarah asked with a small smile, especially the hard days, because we faced them together, because they made the good days that much sweeter. Sarah leaned her head on Xavier's shoulder. I used to have nightmares about that storm, about being lost in the snow, about freezing to death alone. But I do not have them anymore. Now, when I think about that day, all I remember is you appearing out of the storm like an answer to a prayer I did not even know I had said. I remember you lifting me onto your horse and promising to keep me close forever. I have kept that promise, Xavier said. You have. Every single day you have kept that promise, and I promise you the same. I will stay close to you forever, Xavier, in this life and whatever comes after. They sat on the porch until the stars came out, talking and dreaming and remembering. Inside the house, their children laughed and talked, the sound of the family they had built together. Xavier thought about that day 20 years ago when he had seen a dark shape in the snow and ridden over to investigate. That one moment of compassion and instinct had changed everything, had given him a life worth living. Emma married Thomas the following spring in a wedding that filled the church in Wilcox. Xavier walked his daughter down the aisle with tears in his eyes, and Sarah cried openly throughout the ceremony. They threw a reception at their house, which had been expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family. The whole town seemed to show up to celebrate, and Xavier felt overwhelmed by the community they had become part of, the connections they had built. Samuel married a few years later, a smart young woman named Catherine who worked as a teacher at the school. She and Samuel set up house in Wilcox, and Samuel continued to work as Xavier's deputy. Xavier began to think about retirement, about passing the sheriff's position to Samuel, and spending his days with Sarah, traveling and painting and enjoying their grandchildren who were sure to come. Grace surprised them all by falling in love with an artist who came through Wilcox painting portraits. His name was Robert, and he was from Boston, and he asked Grace to marry him and travel the world with him, painting and creating together. Grace said yes, and while Xavier and Sarah were sad to see her go, they were happy she had found someone who understood and supported her dreams. Emma and Thomas had their first child in 1904, a boy they named Xavier after his grandfather. When they brought the baby to meet Xavier and Sarah, Xavier held his grandson and felt the circle complete again. This tiny person who carried his name, who represented the continuation of the family he and Sarah had built. It was a profound moment that left Xavier struggling to find words. "He has your eyes," Sarah said, looking at the baby with so much love that Xavier's chest hurt. "And your nose," Xavier replied. "He is perfect." Samuel and Catherine followed with a daughter a year later, and then Emma had another child, a girl this time. Xavier and Sarah became devoted grandparents, always ready to watch the children, to tell them stories, to spoil them in the way only grandparents can. The house that had once echoed with the sounds of their own children now filled with the noise of grandchildren, and Xavier loved every chaotic minute of it. Xavier finally retired as sheriff in 1906, handing the badge to Samuel in a small ceremony at the jail. He was 60 years old, and while he still felt strong and capable, he was ready to step back and let the younger generation take over. Samuel had proven himself more than worthy of the position, earning the respect of the town through his fairness and courage. Retirement suited Xavier. He spent his days helping Sarah in her garden, taking long rides into the hills, working on repairs around the house. He and Sarah took trips sometimes, visiting Grace in San Francisco where she and Robert had settled, or going to see other parts of Arizona they had never explored. They went back to the mountains every year on the anniversary of their meeting, a pilgrimage to the place where their story had begun. The years continued to pass, each one precious, and filled with moments both grand and simple. They celebrated anniversaries and birthdays, welcomed new grandchildren, supported their children through both joys and sorrows. Samuel became a respected sheriff, following in his father's footsteps. Emma became known throughout the territory for her piano playing and teaching. Grace sent letters and paintings from her travels around the world, each one a window into the exotic life she was living. Xavier and Sarah grew old together, their bodies slowing down but their minds and hearts remaining sharp. They sat on their porch in the evenings, holding hands and watching the world go by. They told each other the same stories they had told 100 times before, and they never grew tired of hearing them. They laughed together and sometimes cried together, processing the losses that come with a long life, the friends who passed away, the changes that transformed the world around them. On their 30th anniversary in 1913, their children threw them a party that seemed to include half of Wilcox. People came from all over to celebrate Xavier and Sarah Holbrook, the couple who had become something of a legend in town. The story of how Xavier had found Sarah in the snow, of how he had whispered that he would keep her close forever, and had spent 3 decades proving it, was told and retold until it took on an almost mythical quality. Xavier made a speech at the party, standing with Sarah at his side, looking out at the sea of faces that included children, grandchildren, friends old and new. He talked about that day 30 years ago, about seeing Sarah huddled in the snow and knowing in his heart that his life was about to change. He talked about the decision to stay in Wilcox, to become a lawman, to build a life with this woman he barely knew but already loved. He talked about the decades of marriage, the challenges and triumphs, the way love grew and evolved over time. "I found Sarah on the worst day of her life," Xavier said, his voice strong despite his age. "And she turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me. I promised her then that I would keep her close forever, and that is a promise I have kept every day since. If I have one piece of advice to give to all of you, it is this. When you find something worth holding on to, do not let go. Build your life around it. Cherish it. Because that is what makes everything else worthwhile." There was not a dry eye in the room by the time Xavier finished speaking. Sarah stood and kissed him, and the room erupted in applause and cheers. They cut a beautiful cake that Emma had made, and they danced together even though their joints creaked and their movements were slower than they once had been. They were surrounded by love, by family, by a community that had become their home. Xavier's health began to fail when he was in his early 70s. Nothing dramatic, just the slow decline that comes with age. He moved more slowly, tired more easily, sometimes had trouble remembering names or details. Sarah remained strong, caring for him with the same devotion he had shown her all those years ago when he had saved her from the snow. She helped him dress, cooked his favorite meals, read to him in the evenings when his eyes grew too tired for reading himself. Samuel and his family had moved into the house with them, Samuel insisting that he wanted to be there to help care for his parents. Xavier was grateful for it, for the presence of family, for the sound of grandchildren playing in the rooms where he had once raised his own children. It felt right, this completion of the circle. On a winter evening in 1916, Xavier sat in his favorite chair by the fire with Sarah beside him. The house was full of family, children, and grandchildren scattered through the various rooms. It had snowed earlier in the day, a light dusting that reminded Xavier of that day so long ago when his life had changed forever. "You remember," Xavier said softly, holding Sarah's hand. "What I said to you when I found you. How could I forget?" Sarah replied, her voice still strong. "You said you would keep me close forever." "I meant it," Xavier said. "I have meant it every day for 35 years, and I will mean it for whatever time we have left." "I know you will," Sarah said, raising his hand to her lips and kissing it gently. "You have never broken a promise to me, Xavier Holbrook, not in all these years." "I love you," Xavier said. "More than I can say, more than I have ever been able to express properly. You were the making of me, Sarah. You took a drifting cowboy with no purpose and gave him a life worth living." "We made each other," Sarah corrected gently. "I was lost when you found me, and not just in the snow. I had lost my parents, my home, everything I knew. But you gave me a new home, a new family, a love I had never dared to hope for. We saved each other, Xavier." They sat together as the fire burned low, talking quietly about their life together, about the children and grandchildren, about the decades of shared memories. Xavier felt tired, more tired than he had ever been, but he also felt at peace. He had lived a good life, a life full of love and purpose and meaning. He had kept his promise to Sarah, had kept her close through everything life had thrown at them. Xavier lived for another 2 years, his health declining slowly but his mind remaining mostly sharp. He spent those years surrounded by the family he and Sarah had created, watching his grandchildren grow, offering advice to his children, holding Sarah's hand every night as they fell asleep together. When he passed away in 1918 at the age of 72, it was peacefully in his sleep, with Sarah lying beside him. The funeral was one of the largest Wilcox had ever seen. Xavier had been part of the town for nearly 40 years, had served as sheriff for over 2 decades, had touched countless lives with his decency and compassion. People came from all over the territory to pay their respects, to share stories about Xavier Holbrook and the impact he had on their lives. Sarah stood at the graveside with her children around her, dry-eyed but pale. She had cried all her tears in private in the days after Xavier's passing. Now she was focused on honoring his memory, on celebrating the life they had shared rather than mourning what she had lost. She knew Xavier would want her to be strong, to keep living, to find joy in their children and grandchildren. After the funeral, Sarah returned to the house that had been their home for so many years. It felt empty without Xavier, too quiet despite being full of family. She wandered through the rooms, touching things that Xavier had touched, remembering moments they had shared. In their bedroom, she found the small wooden horse that Xavier's father had carved for him, the one he had carried in his pocket for years. Sarah held it carefully, this small piece of Xavier's past that he had treasured, and she felt tears threatening again. That night, unable to sleep in the bed she had shared with Xavier for 37 years, Sarah wrapped herself in a blanket and went out to sit on the porch. The night was cold but clear, stars brilliant overhead. She looked up at them and thought about Xavier, about whether he was somewhere among those stars now, looking down at her. "You kept your promise," she whispered to the night. "You kept me close forever, just like you said. And I will keep that promise too. I will hold you in my heart until the day I die, and then we will be close again." Sarah lived for another 12 years after Xavier's death, staying in the house in Wilcox, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren. She continued to paint, creating some of her finest work in those years, landscapes and portraits that captured the spirit of the Arizona territory she had come to love. She was a pillar of the community, respected and admired, known as much for her own accomplishments as for being Xavier Holbrook's widow. But everyone who knew her could see that part of her had died with Xavier. She smiled and laughed and lived her life, but there was a shadow in her eyes that had not been there before, a loneliness that no amount of family could quite fill. She spoke often of Xavier, keeping his memory alive, telling their grandchildren and great-grandchildren the story of how he had found her in the snow and promised to keep her close forever. Sarah passed away peacefully in 1930, at the age of 76, surrounded by her family. Her last words were Xavier's name, spoken with a smile on her face as if she could see him waiting for her. They buried her next to Xavier in the Wilcox Cemetery, under a stone that bore both their names and the inscription, "Forever Close." The house that Xavier and Sarah had filled with love eventually passed to Samuel, and he raised his own grandchildren there, keeping the memory of his parents alive. The story of Xavier and Sarah Holbrook became part of Wilcox's history, a tale told to new generations, a reminder that love could bloom even in the harshest circumstances, that a promise made in desperation could become a lifetime of devotion. The lined shack in the mountains where Xavier had taken Sarah to save her from the storm eventually fell into disrepair and collapsed, reclaimed by the wilderness. But the spot remained, and descendants of Xavier and Sarah would sometimes make pilgrimages there, standing where their great-great-grandparents' love story had begun, feeling the echo of that moment when a cowboy found a woman huddled in the snow and promised to keep her close forever. In the end, that promise had been kept. Through 37 years of marriage, through children and grandchildren, through challenges and triumphs, through the slow decline of age and the inevitability of death, Xavier and Sarah had remained close. Their love had been the foundation of a family that spread across generations, a legacy that lived on long after they were gone. They had found each other in a moment of crisis and built something beautiful and lasting, proving that sometimes the most important decisions we make happen in an instant, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, when we see someone who needs help and choose to act. Xavier Holbrook had been riding that trail on that particular day for reasons he never fully understood. Perhaps it was chance or fate or divine providence. Whatever the reason, he had been there when Sarah needed him most. He had found her huddled in the snow, near death, and he had made a choice. He had wrapped her in his coat, lifted her onto his horse, and whispered a promise that would define the rest of his life. "I will keep you close forever." It had been a promise made in a moment of crisis, but it had become so much more. It had become the guiding principle of Xavier's life, the foundation of a marriage that lasted nearly 4 decades, the beginning of a family line that would continue for generations. It had been a promise that Xavier kept every single day, through word and deed, through the small gestures and the grand romantic moments, through the ordinary days and the extraordinary ones. And Sarah had kept her own promise, the one she made to Xavier under the cottonwood tree, to stay close to him in this life and whatever came after. Even after death separated them, their closeness remained, in the children who carried their genes and their values, in the town that remembered them, in the story that was told and retold until it became legend. The Wild West that Xavier and Sarah had known gradually faded into history. The rough frontier towns became proper cities. The open range was fenced and divided. The outlaws and gunfighters gave way to businessmen and politicians. But the story of Xavier and Sarah endured, a reminder of a time when life was harder but perhaps simpler, when a promise meant something and love could conquer even the harshest circumstances. Their descendants spread across the country over the decades that followed, but many remained in Wilcox, maintaining the connection to the place where Xavier and Sarah had built their life together. The house that had been their home became something of a family landmark, a place where relatives would gather for reunions and celebrations. The cemetery where they were buried became a place of pilgrimage for descendants wanting to pay respects to the couple whose love had started it all. In the end, the story of Xavier and Sarah Holbrook was a simple one, the kind that happened countless times across the Wild West. A man found a woman in distress and helped her. They fell in love and built a life together. They raised children and grew old side by side. But in its simplicity was a profound truth about the power of compassion, the importance of keeping promises, and the way love can transform lives. Xavier had been a drifting cowboy with no ties and no future. Sarah had been a woman who had lost everything and was literally dying in the snow. But they found each other at exactly the right moment, and that chance encounter in a blizzard became the foundation of something beautiful and lasting. They built a family, a home, a legacy that would outlive them both. They proved that love does not always announce itself with fanfare, that sometimes it comes quietly, in the form of a cowboy appearing out of a snowstorm with a promise whispered against frozen hair. I will keep you close forever. 5 simple words that changed 2 lives completely, that created a family, that became a story worth telling. Xavier Holbrook kept that promise for 37 years of marriage and beyond, into the realm of memory and legacy. And Sarah kept her promise to him, to stay close, to be his partner in all things, to build a life together that would matter. Their story ended as all stories must, with death and separation. But the love they shared transcended that ending, living on in their descendants, in the town they had helped build, in the values they had instilled in their children. They had found each other in the worst of circumstances and created the best of lives. They had taken a moment of crisis and transformed it into decades of joy. They had kept their promises to each other, and in doing so, they had created something that would last forever, long after they themselves had passed into memory and legend. 2 names on a stone in a cemetery in Wilcox, Arizona. Forever close, just as Xavier had promised on that snowy day so long ago when he found Sarah and their life together began.